I was talking to somebody today who holds a traditional view that Jesus had to be crucified or had to die. That's how it was said. Had to die on a Friday. And thank you. And and the difficulty is you can't explain to somebody that they become extremely dogmatic. No. Well, you remember the fellow who wrote the book, and he's a local, I believe he lives in California. He wrote, I think Mystery Babylon, Woodrow. He basically followed Hislop's writing and then just on a dime began to reverse all of his positions. Everything that he taught about Easter being coming from the mystery religions and Ishtar, and everything that he changed his position. He went back to the traditional stance that Jesus, in fact, he used to preach and he used to write. He used to do the Wednesday, Saturday. He's now back to the Friday, Sunday position on Easter. And everything that he wrote that was part of the mystery religions, he went back to a traditional view. He wrote a book called, please don't quote me on this, but something like 3 Days, 3 Nights. It's a small book. I have it. And basically, he makes his case in there, beginning with the fact that he says he used to hold the Wednesday, Saturday position for the crucifixion and death and so forth. And I say Wednesday, Saturday, starting at the evening, going through and reckoning the days, but changed to a traditional view and makes his case for why. He explains why he went back to the traditional viewpoint, which I tried to read, and I read all types of material, and I just could not, it didn't gel with me. It not only didn't gel with me, but I just kind of had to scratch my head. How could somebody who has understood the principles go back to a traditional viewpoint? Now, here's the deal, and I'll just tell you straight up, because there'll be people that, especially as I've been teaching in the trial of Jesus, and I've been presenting a lot of things, you cannot understand the deeper things concerning Christ's death and the things he said if you do not have an understanding, a Semitic understanding. If you don't understand the nuances of the law, a lot of this is it's just stuff. There's no depth to it. So I refer many times in many things that I'm studying, I'll always go back to the Talmud, the Mishnah. I'm going to look at those things. They give me a depth. I'm not promoting them, but I do feel they help me to understand much more with a Semitic mindset how people in Christ's day would have understood. We're reading this 2,000 years later with a westernized mindset, with a preconceived notion, being some second, third, even if you're first generation Christian, but you're not reading it with a Semitic mindset. And even a Jew who converts to Christianity probably doesn't have enough grasp of Judaism to understand the Semitic undertones and what really comes to the surface, especially when it comes to reading the scriptures pertaining to these most important and critical things. So in this conversation with this person, and with all due respect, and I say this because everybody's entitled to their own opinion. It's like other things. Everybody has one. But this person went on to say that the reason why it's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday reckoned as 3 days is the way, according to this person, the way they counted the days, how they counted them. Now, you're talking to the wrong person when you go down this pathway, because I came into this as a blank canvas. I didn't come in, although I had traditional baggage from the Catholic Church, but these studies I'm doing and all the things that I'm doing, this is a blank canvas. This is information that over the years I've taken in, I've sifted away the garbage, the stuff that I cannot verify. I've even said to you when something's speculation, I think, whatever. But in reading the scriptures, there are things that you can't just discount. So the argument for this person saying that Friday, Saturday, Sunday constitutes 3 days in their reckoning is out of Acts 10, because the conclusion is that this is the way they reckon time. Now, before you turn there, because we're going to do a little exercise in about 5 minutes, but before you turn there, you at home, get your Bibles, get your Bibles out, get a piece of paper and a pencil handy. But I'm not ready to go there. Just listen to what I'm saying. When I'm reading in John's Gospel, in verse 19, chapter 19, verse 31, and it says that it was the day of preparation. Now that writing of John does not agree with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's something very different about what John is writing concerning his timeline. Now, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but there's a discrepancy there. And John says, and it was, if you read it in the Greek, it was not just a Sabbath, it was a great Sabbath. Day of preparation, great Sabbath. Now, if you're familiar with Jewish law, which I just know just a little bit of Jewish law, but if you're familiar with Jewish law, that reference to great Sabbath, Shabbatot, Gadol or Hagedol, great Sabbath, would usually refer to the Sabbath occurring before the Passover. And in this particular reference, the Sabbath is not being referred to as the Sabbath, the Saturday, Friday, Saturday before the Passover. It's referring to something that happens at this particular time that John is recording as a feast celebration, a set day occurring. These are happening simultaneous. They're all lined up. So if you line them up, you see there was a special Sabbath, a special celebration. John is not using a random word. He uses it elsewhere for the great Sabbath, referring to, I think it's tabernacles. He uses it twice. And it is a very correct Jewish terminology being used in a Greek New Testament. But these are Jews speaking. They're not Greeks. Now, the argument for this person and their reckoning, my argument, of course, begins with what John says, begins with the fact that when Jesus is asked for a sign, he says there will be no sign except the sign of Jonah. And Jonah was in the great fish's, whatever that fish was, in that fish's belly for 3 days and 3 nights. That's what Jesus said. I didn't make that up. That's what he said, 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I brought up Woodrow because Woodrow's whole thing is, well, that's the only time that Jesus said it, but everywhere else he says 3 days and does not use the 3 nights. Well, I think we can safely say that if Jesus said this is the sign, 3 days and 3 nights, there wouldn't just be a statement like 3 days and assume that we are going to reckon the days as we do. A day for us, a full day for us. We can come home from work and say, wow, that was a crazy day at work, right? But we can also look at the calendar, and if today is the 2nd, then all day, starting from 11:59 on our reckoning till 11:59 turning into what becomes the 3rd, that full span of 24 hours is reckoned as a day. So depending on your understanding and terminology, that's how you're going to apply your logic to the Bible. But we're not asking you to apply your logic. I'm not, at least. Because I know what that's looked like in times past. It's looked like a couple of people have escaped from the institutions they've been locked in, and that becomes the rationale for saying, I used my logic. The reckoning for these people, no watch, the sun rising, begins the day. The sun comes up, and as soon as the sun is rising, and the crack of light that comes up begins a day. Now we can talk about how a Sabbath is reckoned, and we can say a Sabbath is reckoned from sundown, and we can begin counting like that. But in terms of how people just reckoned ordinary days, and here comes the argument from this person, that they reckoned the day, a day, as sun up to sundown. Now, you have to be careful with this, because people will say, well, that constitutes a day, and then the next day, and so forth. Until you get into trying to figure out, if you were trying to solve the puzzle, which it's not, it clearly says in the records that Jesus died 3 p.m., and then begins the argument, well, which day was it? And people begin to reckon. Well, just let's go on this person's logic, on their argument, and hold the traditional view that Jesus died on a Friday. Okay? Let's just go with that. And we know the records say, all the records agree, he died at 3 o'clock, and they had to have him in the grave, in that grave, before Sabbath began. Now, conventional wisdom from these same folks will say, well, see, that just proves the point. It had to be that that's the Sabbath that's being referred to, because Friday night begins the Sabbath. Well, that's one Sabbath, but there was another Sabbath. We'll come back to that. Let's reckon the time. 3 p.m., you've done this before, but I'm doing this for new people listening. 3 p.m., Jesus dies. He's got to be in the tomb before sundown. Let's just say sundown will be somewhere between 5 and 7 p.m. Somewhere in that ballpark is going to be sundown. Would you say that's correct? Yes. Oh, it could be maybe as late as 8 o'clock. I doubt it, but let's just say. We're talking about a window. Now, Jesus is in the tomb, in the grave, in the tomb. So let's pick an even number here. Let's just call it 6 o'clock, just to be fair. Now, that, starting at 6 p.m., starts the eve of something, sundown, which is going into the evening, which will become day. Now, Jesus did say, you want to use the logic of short-circuiting what he said about the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights, and just go with he said 3 days. If you're going to use it, but you can't do this, but this is how people get to this. They say, well, Friday night to Saturday makes 1 day, and Saturday to, whoops, what do we do with that? Because that's the end of the Sabbath right there, when the women were coming back to the tomb, Saturday night. You can't make it add up, even if you try to reckon it like that. It cannot add up. And the mystery, or the mystery argument, will be, well, why did they wait so long to go back to the tomb? And if you understand Jewish holidays and the laws that govern those high holy days, there's very good reason of why there would have been a delay. So I asked, how do you reckon time? And the answer was given by something that's chronicled in Acts 10. Now remember, we're going to suppose that Luke began writing, because it says in the beginning that Luke was the one to set out to put all things in order. So we're going to assume that, at least until this part of Acts, Luke is writing. Because the person also who told me this also said that they also got their information from the last chapter of Luke, or the second to last chapter, where the two are walking along the road, and it says, and it's now the 3rd day as they're going. Oh yeah, you already know where I'm going, right? Now listen, with all due respect to this person, but that is that traditional mindset that cannot break free, because people celebrate this day and it must be that. And so therefore you're at an impasse. You have to come up with how to make it fit. But I want you to see the reckoning. So Acts 10. Open your Bibles to Acts 10. And I'll tell you when you're going to have to write something down to keep track of something. In fact, just to make my life easier, I've got the New Revised Standard. Of course, this will make it even plainer. You can make the notes as I give them to you. In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, or band, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all of his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon, about 3 o'clock. Write that down. One afternoon. It doesn't say anything except one afternoon about 3 o'clock. Your King James says what? What hour? Ninth hour. All right, 3 o'clock. He had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, What is it, Lord? And he answered, Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who's called Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his slaves, a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him, and after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa. You've got to write this down as well. From Caesarea to Joppa, we're gonna guesstimate here somewhere between 30 and 40 miles. And if you look it up, it'll either say 36 or 39. Not quite, I don't remember. So just somewhere between 30 and 40 miles. That's a day's journey. In this day we're looking at, that's a full day's journey. Okay? So, about noon the next day, as they were on their journey approaching the city. You need to write that down too. At noon, the next day. So, the day before, at 3 o'clock, one afternoon, 3 o'clock, the day before, he sent his men on the way. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray, and he became hungry and wanted something to eat. You figure he'd go to the kitchen instead of the roof. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven open and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, Get up, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean. The voice said to him again a second time, What God has made clean, you must not call profane. This happened 3 times, and then the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. Hold that thought. They were asking for Simon's house, and they were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, Look, 3 men, I like that type of guidance, look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them. So Peter went down to the men and said, I am the one you're looking for. What is the reason for your coming? They answered, Cornelius, the centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say. So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. That means they stayed there a night. Write that down. The next day, he got up and went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa, and accompanied him. The following day, you making notes of this? We're chronicling a time here. The following day, they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him and, falling at his feet, worshipped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, Stand up, I'm only a mortal. And he talked with him, went in, and found that he had assembled, many had assembled, and he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now may I ask why you sent for me?" And Cornelius replied, 4 days ago, at this very hour, at 3 o'clock, I was praying in my house when suddenly a man in dazzling clothes stood before me. You heard enough. The reason is not to recount Cornelius' story. It's to tell you that Cornelius says 4 days ago, when he was praying. Now, go back with me, and I want you to comb this over. See, Scripture, if you look for it, you can find precise time. This whole passage starts off by saying, one afternoon about 3 o'clock, he had a vision. And it's very specific. You can see, if you were counting this, Cornelius says 4 days ago. And if you read carefully, you recognize that the men had to travel. So what we may be calling a day may simply represent the day itself. It may not represent a period which we understand to be what we reckon as a 24-hour period. So in everything you calculated, forgetting that Cornelius says 4 days ago, how many days, here we go, how many days do you count from the time, not that Cornelius is saying he was praying, but from the time that he dispatched his men, how many days are you counting until they got back to Cornelius? Did everybody come to that? 3 or 4? You still, jury's not out. Okay, wait a minute. We gotta let the people at home call in and give an answer too. This is one of those few times where I'm going to let you call in and give your answer on the phone. And don't think about what Cornelius says 4 days ago. And this is important because this is how people will use words to say they're reckoning the time. But if you count carefully, I'll walk you through this. He says it was 3 o'clock when he had a vision. And then he has the men come and he tells them what happened. So let's figure that he has the men come and he tells them what happened. 3 o'clock he has this vision and he summons the men and they come and say that by the time they actually depart, if they even departed that evening, maybe they had to go back to their place and gather their stuff, but whatever time they left at, we know that the next day, about noon, they were approaching the proximity of where Peter was. That is a 30-some-odd mile journey. So you do some math that they had to leave in sufficient time to arrive there by noon. Okay, more math for you. If it's a let's round this off. If it's a 35-mile journey and someone can walk at, say, 2.5 to 3 miles an hour, how long would it take to get there by foot? They arrived there about noon. That'll tell you about when they left if they walked. And if they went by horseback or donkey, you might add an extra mile, because I'm sure they weren't going at warp speed through the sand going from Joppa to Caesarea. They get there about noon the next day. Peter's in a trance on the rooftop, comes down, talks to them. He tells them to come in and stay with them, stay the night. They lodge with him. The next day, they get up and they go. And the following day, they come to Caesarea. How many days is that? Okay, not all of you are counting. Some of you are still thinking. I'm going to open the phone lines. I want to know how many days you reckon. Forget about what Cornelius says 4 days ago. I want to know how many days you're reckoning here. I'm opening up the phone lines now, and they're going to bring me your responses. So get on the telephone. Some of you are still writing down the answers, so you run them up to me if you have some. Texas says 3 days. Pasadena says 3 days. Citrus Heights says, I'm saying 3 days. Chino Hill says, 3 days have passed. Los Angeles says, I get 3 days. Oh, let me read the other ones because somebody else says, I think it's 3.5 to 4 days. Stockton says, I count 4. I keep getting 4. I think I'm wrong. Arizona says 3 days. Santa Clara says, my opinion is 3 days. Oh, this is interesting here. Thank you for whoever called this in from Glendale. Says, in the NIV version, in Acts 10:30, it says 3 days ago. Good observation. We're going to check you out in a minute. Connecticut says 3 days, and this is fun. Glendale says 72 hours after the first 3 p.m. Okay. Hawaii says, I counted 3 days. Minnesota says, I've got 3 days. San Bernardino says, I'm confused. Palmdale says, looks like just over 3 days. Oh, here's a new one. Connecticut says, I'm saying 2.5 days. Okay. We'll go over that in a minute. Woodland Hills says, I think it was 6 days. Nevada says 3. Idaho says 4. Overton says, I think it took less than 3 days. New York says, I'm counting 4 days. Wow. Somebody says 5 days. Illinois says, discounting their travel time, it would be 3 days. Redwood City says, I got 3 days. Vancouver says, 3 days is my guess. And Stockton says, I'm guessing 3 days, and my brain is toast. Anybody here have an NIV? No? No NIV? Steve, you look like an NIV. You don't have an NIV? Traitor. All right. Bring that Bible. Is that an NIV? Well, that's an Old Testament. Is that a New Testament? Oh no, I need a New Testament. Wrong place. We're gonna take this King's House word that it actually says that. Now, question is, why bother paying attention to this? Because this is how, based on reckoning this time, this person counted how they would count the days for the burial, the time that Jesus was in the tomb, and that do you see where I'm going? This is the way they reckon the time. Now, if you're reading along with me, follow along with me for a second. Let's go back and take a look at that. A little bit of math, a little bit of details. Now, one important word here. Beginning with in the afternoon about 3 o'clock. So remember, he supposedly says that when they got there, he says it was just about this time, the same time. He says, "4 days ago." I got to look up this word now. It's really bothering me. You got to all hold on for a minute. You know, there's nothing like looking up a word right when you're right in the middle of something. Can't make any more suspense than this. Pastor Scott is a mood killer. Right in the middle of something, she picks up the Strong's. You got to check out a word. But I'm staring at a Greek word right now that is just saying, you better look this up. Let's see. That's at verse 30. You have no idea. Maybe you do of what I'm looking up. Let's see if we can find it real quick. Okay, so nothing wrong with what I'm looking at. That is, I was thinking, that could be, but it's the Greek word for here, for fourth day, tetartes emeras, fourth, pertaining to a fourth or from a fourth. We're good there. So whatever the NIV said, that was just based on the calculations and not based on what the Greek said. Cornelius is saying on the fourth day, but he says, at this very hour, 3 o'clock, he's recounting as he's telling it. Now, if you start with where he's praying, or at 3 o'clock, he sees this vision, and the men come after he tells them the vision, and he's going to send the men to Joppa. Forget about the day and think about the fact that between the time, 3 o'clock, and that he would dispatch the men by about sundown. Let's just say they came to him, they heard, they had to grab their stuff, and they're off. There's a 3-window time perhaps till sundown. And even if you are reckoning the days as simply a day as in daylight, their traveling time, they had to travel during the night to get there about noon the next day. If you factor, even if they went quickly, even if they went quickly on a 30 to 40 mile journey, they would have had to have left after they talked to Cornelius, and most likely made some part of their trip in the dark. But irregardless of that, the very fact that 3 o'clock this happens does not constitute, by the way, a full day anyway. So when Cornelius says, 4 days ago, at this very hour, is he referring to, in his mind, 4 days ago at this very hour as we refer to a day? Or is he referring to the way we've been counting, a day and a night and a day and a night? So you do the math. He has this vision at 3 o'clock, and after this vision he calls his servant and slave and sends them out to find Peter at Joppa. They arrive about noon the next day. This reminds me of where'd the other dollar go? They arrive at noon the next day. They talk to Peter. Peter says, stay with me here. They stay, and on the next day, they take off and they make their trip. And if you read carefully, it says they got up and they left, and the following day they came to Caesarea, which means they may not have left early in the day, and you've got some time that elapsed. In other words, so now by the time they get to Cornelius, and by the time they're in, Cornelius is saying 4 days ago at this time, but the whole time they traveled makes up 3 days. They weren't traveling on the day that he had the vision. The men left, but they didn't get to where Peter was until the next day, and that's 3 days. 3 days between when they encountered Peter, they stayed the night, and they left. There's 3 days right there, not 4. Cornelius is then going to say, 4 days ago I had this vision, because he had the vision, he dispatched the men that night, but then the next day they're arriving at noon. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you count the days properly, even though Cornelius is saying 4, the whole travel time that occurs in 3 days. Okay, use this reckoning and try and make an application. And this was the logic. I'm still, by the way, lest you think we've departed and we've gone on some specialty freak show tonight, we're still on the subject of of trying to see how someone could reckon 3 days and count 3 days and get Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, considering everybody agrees that by the time the Sabbath was over, the women were at the tomb after the Sabbath, and Jesus was out of the tomb. Sometime after the Sabbath and before the sun came up, Jesus came out of the grave. So the question is still the same. If people will read and say, well, he rose Sunday morning, the famous sunrise service. Well, technically speaking, he really did come out of the grave sometime after Saturday sundown, and sometime between Saturday sundown and Sunday morning sunup, and somewhere in between there, he came out of the grave after the Sabbath was over and the women came. But it doesn't change the fact that if you were trying to reckon time, you could not arrive at calculating 3 days by a Friday death and burial by 3 p.m. and being out of the grave, out of the tomb after the Sabbath, even if you wanted to say he rose up and came out of the grave, even like the traditional viewpoint that says Sunday morning at sunrise. That still wouldn't make 3 days, unless you were counting Fridays a day, which has already passed. That's my point. This is why you can't use the same mindset of counting. This person was dogmatic and said this trip and this whole thing was 4 days. No, Cornelius had a vision, and after he had that vision at 3 p.m., he called the men, and by the time the men left, it had to be somewhere around sundown when they left, and they got to where Peter was at noon the next day, and Peter says, come in and stay with me. Forget about when Cornelius had the vision. The men arrived where Peter was at noon. And then he says, stay with me. And they stayed that night. And then the next day, it says they didn't depart just yet, but they didn't get to Caesarea, but they departed, and they arrived the following day. There's 3 days. Forget about Cornelius and what he saw. That's not even relevant to the conversation. The men were traveling 36 or how many miles. Now, the same argument says, don't you hate these things? Same argument will say, remember, same writer. This is why you can never analyze Scripture by trying to. Luke wrote in one style, and I just said to you, if Luke wrote this far into Acts, which I believe he did, but he also wrote his own gospel. So turn to Luke and read what happens in the 24th chapter. We have the passage in Luke 24 where they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. That's the first day of the week, very early in the morning. And if you keep reading through this, and we know the whole passage that happens, the women are telling what they saw, and they thought they were idle tales, and they ran out. Peter runs out to the sepulchre. He bows down. He looks. He sees the linen clothes laying there, but no Jesus. And then you've got those two disciples walking on the road, and they did not know that Jesus was, of course, walking with them. Their eyes, verse 16, were holden that they should not know him. And he said unto them, what manner of communications are these that ye have to one another, as if ye walk and are sad? And of course, they're going to say to Jesus, what are you new here? You must be a stranger. You don't know the things that are come to pass here in these days? And he said to them, what things? Don't you love Jesus? I love that. What things? They said unto him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, which was a prophet, mighty in deed and in word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and have crucified him. But we trusted that that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. And beside all this, today is the third day since these things were done. I want you to think about this, because this all takes place on the same day where Jesus came out of the tomb. I said somewhere after sundown Saturday, after the Sabbath was over, which technically by law would constitute the beginning of the next day, but the next day would only really begin at sunup. So somewhere between sundown and sunrise, Jesus came out of the tomb, which is still now the third day. And this is all happening on the same day. There isn't some record in here when you read of everything, and on the morrow. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say, and then whatever. This is all the same. And behold, two of them went that same day to a village. The same day. So if there's any confusion, the day that next day, which now technically would be, it would already be sunlight and Sunday, they encounter Christ. And they say, besides all this, today is the third day since these things were done. And something else is said. Yea, and certain women also of our company made us astonished, which were earlier at the sepulchre, and when they found not his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels, which said that he was alive. Certain of them which were with us went to the sepulchre, found it even so as the women had said, but they saw him not. And then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Now, the rest of this kind of fades into the background. My point is that all this happened on the same day. This is not, traditional reckoning says a different calculation. We're looking at the very fact that there's no disagreement. Jesus came out of the tomb sometime after the Sabbath Saturday. When the Sabbath was over at sundown, Jesus came out of the tomb sometime between that time and sunup. And this event occurs on the same day. Now, this very same dear soul that was trying to tell me that out of Acts 10 reckons the days as so was trying to convince me that this represents the same type of reckoning. But in fact, if you read it carefully, you realize that the same writer is very careful to present something that makes it very clear. The events that are happening right here are being chronicled as the day, the actual day, the day that the women came to the tomb, that he was not there. And then during that day, which is still a part of that same day, not to be reckoned as the day apart from the night, Sabbath, to the next day, but that whole day. And that's how you reckon time. This isn't the fourth day, this is the third day. And that's why I said you have to be careful about the way you count. So I ask you again, how is it possible, if this being the third day by the very mouth and pen of Luke, how could the third day be the third day if the third day only constituted a half of a day? Did you get what I'm saying? Because these disciples are walking. This is after they went to the tomb, and the tomb is empty. Indulge me. Whether they went late at night, let's take some liberty. Whether they went late at night, whether they went at 6 o'clock, or whether they went at 4 in the morning, doesn't matter to me. At some point they came after the Sabbath, and Jesus was out of the tomb. We know he was out of the tomb by the time the sun came up. That's for sure. So right there, somewhere in between there, that begins the third day. And the third day carries over from Sabbath time. The third day carries over. They say, seeing it is the third day, which tells you how they reckon time. So there's no way you could get to say that 3 days could be counted the way people have tried to reckon it and say, well, this happened on Friday. He was crucified on Friday. In fact, I was reading several different sources and different books that give a very scholarly approach, and then they go back to the Friday thing. But the bigger issue on the table is the traditional viewpoint. Now, is this going to wreck anything? Is your faith going to be slammed because you either hold the traditional viewpoint or you don't and you believe a earlier time in the week, and that he came out of the tomb as I'm describing, is that going to change anything? I mean, the main thing is he came out of the tomb. That's, if you want to start analyzing the minutiae of everything, but if you're going to study this book, and it's going to break some of your traditions, you've got to embrace that, because God's telling us something about him, and he's not saying, now, even though this is hard to accept, you just go about your business now and put those blinders back on, because that's what everybody wants you to. This is the groove everybody's going in, so you've got to make sure you stay in that groove. No, you expose yourself to some things that may be hard for other people who haven't studied the Bible, or maybe who do and just choose to stay in a traditional groove because that's what is accepted, just like Christmas. Is this going to wreck somebody's faith because we can't come to clarity about this particular thing? No. But if you're going to talk about fulfillment of set times, and if you're going to talk about the law and what was permissible, what was allowed, if you're going to talk about those things, you're going to have a hard time convincing me that being placed in the tomb Friday night, or Friday, dying at 3 o'clock and being in the tomb before Sabbath begins, before sundown, and Saturday sundown constitutes, by any calculation, 3 days, let alone 3 nights. You can't get to it from there. Now, why am I telling you this? Because this all started because of a conversation I had with this person, and I just happened to be studying John chapter 19 and verse 31 out of the Greek, to just pay attention to what's said there, and that stumped me, because it's the only place that something like this is being said. The Jews, therefore, because it was the day of preparation, that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was a high day, or literally from the Greek, a great megalon, a great Sabbath. So think about that. And let me ask you a question. How are we to interpret the King James says Sabbath day, and when you simply read it in the Greek, it says Sabbaton. And it doesn't say whether it's a Sabbath day, it just says it's a Sabbath. Oops. So the point is, sometimes these exercises simply prove one thing. You can gather a bunch of people in a room and they're all reading the same thing. You heard the messages, be a lot of different things come out of there. Our mindset, for us, what is a day? As I said, you had a hard day at the office versus a calendar day, versus how the Jews reckoned time. And if you're not willing to read this through the eyeballs of the way they would have understood it in their time, you shouldn't even try to get to the nubbin. You shouldn't even try to get anywhere. You should just probably even put the book down. It was not designed as a Western mindset writing tool, but only someone who could understand. These people understood their language and their culture. We have to get that mindset in order to wrap our minds around this. So the reckoning, unfortunately, when I was talking to this person, all I could do was just say, wow, that's great, because I realized this was going to not go anywhere. Now, to the traditional church people, well, I'm a lunatic. I may be a heretic. But to anybody who's willing to look, I just proved a point. You were all reading the same scripture. Most of you came up with 3 days, because the question I asked wasn't, I said, put aside Cornelius saying 4 days ago. We're not talking about the day that he had his vision, but how many days were they, since they departed and arrived with Peter, how many days were they in transit? How many days did that take? 3 days. So when they get there, he says 4 days ago, because 4 days ago he had a vision. But it didn't take them 4 days. They weren't at Peter's place for 4 days, and it didn't take them 4 days to make the trip. You got to be careful with these things. Now, somebody listening tonight is going to say, well, you just confused me. Well, the only thing you need to really realize is, and we'll be looking at this important not only to understand and put some color on Jesus' death and burial, you even have to go back to Exodus and read a little bit and study a little bit of the Hebrew, looking at the Passover and understanding a little bit of that first Passover, and then going into Leviticus and reading a broader laying out of the Passover and what goes along with it, and what is said there, which is there will be a holy convocation, a set time, a set day. And a lot of confusion with people who, the same people who will confuse the days, will also confuse the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover. So get the terms and the terminology straight, and then go back and you recognize that there's actually some internal things that we can pick out of the scriptures to get an idea. The writers all agreed. Maybe not all agreed about darkness coming over the land. Maybe one chronicled and one other didn't. But there are other things that we can go on to show us a little bit more about this idea that maybe Friday, the traditional viewpoint, is just, that's an easy thing to say, but you still can't fit 3 days, considering the time that he died and that he was buried. You cannot get 3 days out of our reckoning, what is only really a day and a half. That's the bottom line. And you can be mad at me, and you can, well, I don't like that. It's the same mindset. People will say, well, there's so many incongruities and inconsistencies in the scriptures, and are these things reliable? You've got to read carefully. One of the records has Mary running back, as she, in one chronicle, is supposedly alone. But when she goes back to tell the disciples, she uses a plural pronoun. She says, we saw, we, da-da-da, which tells you that there were other people. The writer is writing about Mary, but there was other people with her when she says, and we, da-da-da-da-da. I can imagine her running back out of breath. And what we saw, if she only saw what she saw, and the writer was wanting to tell us that she was alone, then she would have said to them, what I saw was, but instead she says, we. Without knowing, if you didn't have the other records, that the other women in other records are there. In this record, she's alone. No, she's not alone. She's chronicled at first as being alone. When she runs back, she says, this is what we saw. And you've got to read those little pieces to put it all together. When you read them all and you put them all together, there may be a few things, as I just pointed out in John 19:31. You've got to work a little bit on that. But all these other things do not give anything but what I say, they're internal clues. You've got to look for them, but they're there. God did that deliberately. So the people who really want to know and really want to know the truth will open up the book and they'll probe to find the truth is there. Now, if that insults you, that's life. For me, I'm going to go with what Jesus said repeatedly to his disciples. Mark 8:31, Mark 9:31, and in Mark 10:30, I think it's 10:33, somewhere in there, 3 times over, he talks about in building an escalation as the time is coming forward, talking about how he must die, and it was very specific about the people who would be there to essentially bring him to his death, and talks about the 3rd day, and very, very specifically, with that much precision, you'll find elsewhere in the writing enough information to give us a solid basis for putting aside a Friday, Saturday / Sunday reckoning and putting that in perspective, fulfilling one time that those same people, one set time that those same people will overlook because they are not factoring that Jesus had to fulfill all of the set times. All right, math quiz is over. For those of you who didn't call in your answer, I still want to hear from you. I'm still wanting to know. Now, I told you what I said. There'll be some of you hardheads, like the 5 and the 6 day people. I don't know where you got that from. Keep counting, but get on the telephone.
Come to this house.